Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. I'm Roland Green, director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and I want to welcome you to the first event in a new series, How Change Comes, Knowledge and Justice in 2020. This is our 40th anniversary at the Stanford Humanities Center, and one way we're celebrating is by launching several new series and new initiatives. Before I say a few words about our speaker, let me briefly mention the origins of this series. When you're a scholar in the humanities who encounters a lot of PhD students, as I do, and as our speaker does, you notice that the current generation of younger people in our fields is especially interested in both making an intellectual career and making a difference in the world. My students and others often ask me where they can find models of rigorous scholarship that accommodates activism. When I became director of the center about a year ago, I thought we should fashion a series that would bring to Stanford significant figures in their various disciplines who have shown a commitment to leveraging their scholarship in the service of changing the conditions of the present, whether that means advocating prison reform, running an NGO, or producing multimedia advocacy about against the destruction of the environment. We will offer events in this series several times a year, and we welcome nominations of speakers. If you are a graduate student at Stanford or anywhere, if you are an undergraduate, if you are simply a scholar or a member of our intellectual community, who for you are the models that you would like to hear from? Please let us know. And we would love to try to accommodate people's interests as the series goes on. When we were first discussing this series about a year ago, I said that the first speaker I wanted to invite was a particular historian with a long record of uncovering archival materials that tell a story about the big picture of the making of the modern world, who a few years ago turned his expertise to his own institution, the University of Texas at Austin. Locating and analyzing a lot of fugitive information, he produced on his own, without institutional support, a report that documented the consistent bias against Latinx faculty in salaries and other matters at UT Austin. Today's event is the first of two appearances in the series by Jorge Cañizares-Esguerra of UT Austin. Today he will present work in progress from a forthcoming project in a lecture titled Conquest, Collapse and Rise of Ancien Regime in 16th Century Spanish America and the Role of Paper Archives. Then on Friday of this week, September 25th at 11 a.m. Pacific, Professor Cañizares will join us again to discuss his institutional research and its outcomes, as well as the broader questions raised at the intersection of scholarship and justice. That event is called Conversations on the History of Hispanics in the US from Marginality to More Marginality, the Case of Latinx Faculty. I hope you will be able to be with us again on Friday. Details may be found on the Humanities Center's website. As a procedural matter, I note that today's talk is recorded and will be posted on the Humanities Center's website by the end of the week. And as we always do in our online series, you are invited to submit questions through the question and answer, the Q&A function on Zoom. A leading historian of Latin America, Jorge Cañizares-Esguerra, has been occupied for more than 20 years in demonstrating how the history of that region was made in the colonial period and how that history has been a metonymy for modernity in the West. Recovering often through archival research how knowledges in Latin America emerged in ways different from those in Europe, and thus how categories such as the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, supposedly the origins of modernity, obscure the existence of intellectual exchange according to the local forms and practices of Latin America, and ultimately the emergence of a modernity that differs from and explains the one whose story has been so often told in France, Britain, and elsewhere. Professor Cañizares is the author of 3 books published by Stanford University Press: How to Write the History of the New World, 2002, Puritan Conquistadors, 2006, and Nature, Empire, and Nation, 2007, and is at work on 2 more. one that situates the Spanish Empire at the center of an alternative Western modernity, and another challenging intellectual categories. He is the co-editor of 6 books, including Entangled Empires, Anglo-Iberian Atlantic Worlds 1599 to 1830, and the Princeton Handbook of Atlantic History. He is a notably successful mentor of PhD students. Within a decade, 6 of his students have received his department's award for best dissertation. Several of his former students have recently obtained prizes in the profession, and in 2018, he was honored with the Nancy Relker Mentorship Award of the American Historical Association. Jorge Cañizares-Esguerra is the Alice Drysdale Sheffield Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin. Please join me in welcoming him to Stanford virtually and thanking him for inaugurating our series. Jorge, it's great to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to being here in the webinar, and I really appreciate the introduction, so generous. My intention today is to read off a script and share with you some documents in the hope of making a larger argument about paperwork and archives in 16th century Spanish America. This is part of a larger project that I am writing with a former student of mine, Adrian Masters, who is now a postdoc at Tübingen in Germany. And the title of our book is The Radical Spanish Empire, Petitions and the Creation of the New World, that is under contract with Harvard University Press. So I'll be exploring the argument of the book as a whole, but focusing on the issue of archives in particular. So without further ado, I'll begin reading my talk, and I'll be introducing some images as I read. So first, I want to share the screen, and then move away from here. Okay. This talk is part of a book that emerged from several years of conversations with Adrian Masters as he was working on his dissertation on petitioning in the 16th century Spanish America. Adrian demonstrated that hundreds of thousands of royal decrees were not just top-down fiats by a distant, overbearing authoritarian monarch, but the result of bottom-up petitions by vassals. Adrian proved that royal decrees were simply verbatim copies of letters sent by vassals of many social backgrounds, including male and female elites, and commoners of countless ethnic backgrounds, to the king and his council of the Indies. This unfolding insight led us to question the liberal historiography's depiction of British America as a democratic, free-thinking, and modern foil to its downtrodden, corrupt, and medieval counterpart to the south, namely the Spanish Empire. By following the ways the Spanish monarchy's many vassals used petitions and litigation, we began to see patterns of radical social mobility and massive bottom-up participation that most major scholarship has failed to conceptualize. Our conversations and investigations gradually have developed a model which explains why the Spanish context did not become an orderly Ancien regime society between 1530 and 1570, and why, when it finally matured from 1570 to 1600, its social order was deeply alien to Iberia and much of Europe. Namely, we pinpoint how the Spanish America's gargantuan bottom-up paperwork and local archives initially frustrated indigenous elites, powerful conquistadors, and friars. Gradually, a unique trinity of New World power emerged: royal favor, local archives, and wealth. Vassals of all backgrounds who mastered these three sources of power master a novel Ancien regime built on paper, silver, and persuasion. Those who did not fade slipped into anonymity. This dramatic century was thus not only one of violence and disease, but colossal bottom-up participation in imperial rule, radical political and conceptual invention, social mobility, both upward and downwards, and willy questioning of the most cherished indigenous and Iberian mores or mores. This model upsets the master narratives about Spanish America's formative century and exposes the myth underpinning British liberal exceptionalist scholarship. So here you have a typical petition, or well, not petition, a contract, a capitulation of the crown with the conquistador. In this case is Antonio Cedeño's capitulation or contract to colonize Trinidad y Paria, that is in tierra firme, what today is Venezuela. What is striking about this contract is that it's one of hundreds of contracts the crown signed with hundreds of conquistadors. Most of these contracts organize or allow for the organization of expeditions to different regions of the Americas and Asia as well. And most of these expeditions fail miserably. Only a few of them succeeded. Among them, of course, we have Columbus's, Cortes's, Alvarado's, Pizarro's, etc., Quesada in Colombia. But most of the expeditions organized on these contracts signed by the crown and conquistadors fail miserably. Now, why these contracts matter? These contracts matter because well, of them were different. They engaged in different negotiations with the crown, tax exceptions, certain commitments on the part of conquistadors to certain things in terms of trading fortifications, in terms of the length of territory they would control, the type of rule they will have, access to certain resources, their ability to issue laws or not, to issue gracia or not, that is Mercedes, rewards or not. Every element of these different aspects of governance and gracia were regulated by these capitulaciones. What these capitulaciones did was to create a lot of conflict, a lot of rivalry, and a lot of factions within these communities and these societies. The recently arrived conquistadors, recently arrived expeditions. There were dozens of these factions, not only because there were many different conquistadors who participated in these garage enterprises, as it were, but also because the crown would send their own accountants or send some kind of visitadores, overseers, and to make sure that his quinto, his taxes, or her taxes, in the case of Isabel, were protected, her tribute was protected. So that factionalism led to a lot of litigation, a lot of writing to the crown on the part of the opposing factions, demanding control and oversight over the powers that had been given away to the conquistadors. So here you have a litigation about Cristobal Colon that is typical of the many trials that Columbus had to face, either private trials, individuals who complained and took him to court, or the fiscal of the crown, that is the prosecutor of the crown, that would draw on these letters sent from the Caribbean, complain about Columbus, and they would make sure to put boundaries and to limit the nature of the original contract. So here you have a typical process of that, the paperwork of that litigation. Columbus had many of these things. His power was very diminished. Eventually, he lost control over most of the islands of the Caribbean. Tierra Firme went to the control of visitadores sent by the crown and judges sent by the crown. The same for Yucatan, ultimately. So the Columbus family lost control over most of the islands and Tierra Firme, the continent that began to emerge. Another typical litigant who rose, just like the Columbuses, out of these contracts and also had to face a number of challenges is Irvan Cortes. This is a letter sent by Cortes, one of the last letters sent by Cortes in 1544 to Charles V, complaining how much he had lost from the original mercedes and capitulaciones that the crown, Charles V, had given him after the conquest of Tenochtitlan. It's a long letter in which he argues that the conquest of Mexico was easier than the conquest of the lawyers of Charles V. He had lost all the wealth, all the power, he says, that he gained conquering Tenochtitlan and central Mexico and other places in Central America. He had lost most of that power to the lawyers of the crown and to the lawyers of private parties, including his first father-in-law and mother-in-law, who took him to court because he had strangled his first wife. These litigation, these type of paperwork that I just presented of capitulaciones, contracts, and petitions of conquistadors also apply to indigenous communities. As soon as indigenous communities began the contact with conquistadors and alliances, cross-ethnic alliances, in the case of Mexico, Cortes and the Tlaxcalans, Cortes and the Purépecha in Michoacán, and many other alliances that led to further conquests. So most of the conquest of Central America was not really Spanish, but it was indigenous in that these alliances led to participation of indigenous communities of all kinds in the north of Mexico, the War of the Mixtón, for instance, or the campaigns of Nuño de Guzmán in Panuco, Nueva Vizcaya, in the north of Mexico, where the mines eventually appeared, the silver mines of Parral and other places, were conducted by indigenous armies. And here you have a petition by a community, the Huejotzinco, that is part of a case against Nuño de Guzmán by his rivals, Cortes, Alvarado, and others in central Mexico that are trying to cut Nuño de Guzmán to size. And Huejotzinco, this Altepetl, this city-state made of many, many different neighborhoods, filed a document that is now called the Códice of Huejotzinco, that is at the National Library in Washington, that kind of documents all the things that they contributed to the campaign of Nuño de Guzmán, including a pendant of the virgin made out of feathers, but also grass for horses in quantities, in high quantities, 400. I mean, these are numbers. These are all numbers in Aztec or Nahua arithmetic and algebra. Coin, gold, but also slaves. Here you have the many slaves contributed by Huejotzinco to the campaign of Nuño to the north. Slaves were kind of part of that expansion. They worked as porters, carriers, etc. And one of the reasons why these communities like Huejotzinco would participate in these campaigns because they were interested in raiding other societies and acquire labor to work for the caciques. So not only the conquistadors participating in paperwork, but also indigenous communities like Huejotzinco. Now, I continue. Our book, The Radical Spanish Empire, focuses on the early modern empire of paper, Spanish America, that experienced radical forms of social mobilization and governance that today we associate with modernity, quote unquote. Yet these very new forms of radical modernity led paradoxically to the constitution of hierarchical Ancien regimes, unlike any other in Europe. Paperwork created the Spanish America by first encouraging massive political participation in the business of government, collapsing through mediation and alliances, European and Amerindian power elites. And here I want to show you some examples of what I mean. Let me continue. The talk seeks to argue that private local archives and paperwork allowed for radical social mobility and the toppling of lineages and dynasties by commoners of all kinds. Mobility was just limited by the imagination and power of the petitioner to summon witnesses and muster credible narratives. Yet as viceroys, bishops, and the Inquisition began to develop archives of their own, mobility began to shift. Only individuals with access to local patronage, cash, and archives of their own could defeat rivals and establish lineages. So in the case of Cortes, Colón, and others, you have this connection with authorities back in Spain and their own archives. And it's this combination of archives, cash, and connections that allow them to either succeed or be defeated, their lineages to continue or their lineages to disappear. And there is this up and down of encomenderos and conquistadors throughout the 1500s. By the 1570s, however, the crown entered fully in the battle over archives to codify and index petitions of gracia, that is Mercedes, and gobierno for the first time, the hundreds of thousands of cédulas or royal decrees that were produced out of this competition, this rivalry, all these many, many dozens of factions that are writing to the crown and petitioning for new rules that would benefit them, or are petitioning the viceroy as well locally for mandamientos and ordenanzas. There is a massive production of ordenanzas and mandamientos, local rules that are issued by viceroys in Mexico, like Mendoza and Velasco for 30 years. And we're talking about tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of these rules that are the product of mediation and conflict among factions and mediation among these powerful figure that is the viceroy. Well, the crown begins to step in this business as well. Not only viceroys, not only bishops, not only the Inquisition, but the crown itself. The creation of imperial archives, along with the rise of cash culture in the New World by commoners of all kinds, and the need to fight piracy and imperial rivals, changed the nature of social mobility, creating a new Ancien regime. Anyone with access to archives, crown patronage, and cash to buy archives of others who were cashless and create businesses could establish lineages and status versus penniless rivals who might have had archives, might have had connections to the crown, but lacked cash, like money, like some of the Moctezumas, for instance, who lost their archives to commoner Otomis, as we'll see in a minute. This particular process yielded a new form of Ancien regime, a system in which mobility was not necessarily attached to social racial states, a new type of society in global history, literally. This same participation, however, led to the creation of top-down archives that not only slowed down the pace of change, but also created a peculiarly resilient new Ancien regime, neither indigenous nor European. By the late 16th century, any individual who had a royal favor, a robust personal archive, and money could secure status and lineage regardless of social or racial origins. Our book seeks to explain this paradoxical trajectory of the early modern Spanish-American polity, poised between radicalism, cultural, political, social, and epistemological, and seemingly awkward, tottering immobility. How to theorize the conquest then? In traditional accounts, a handful of Spaniards appended bewildered native rulers and rapidly implemented a Catholic state model off of late medieval ideals, albeit with a new absolutist and authoritarian twist. Our book argues for a drastically different perspective. It begins by merging the new conquest history with its emphasis on indigenous political and alliances with indigenous politics and alliances with conquistadors, to more fine-grained studies on the conquistadors' drastic fall from power between 1530 and 1570. Entire dynasties collapsed. Quite unexpectedly, friars during this period stepped into the power vacuum caused by these twin collapses, only to lose power by the 1570s as well. So it's not only that the conquistadors collapsed, but also many of the indigenous dynasties and caciques that had made alliances with these conquistadors collapsed. The few historians who do acknowledge the collapse of indigenous conquistadors and monastic power tend to explain these groups' misfortunes as a product of the Habsburg state's absolutism, which could not tolerate powerful elites. By contrast, we argue that the triple downfall was also due to the Habsburgs' harnessing of two great but little explored phenomena: a deluge of bottom-up paperwork against Indies strongman, and the universal denunciation by subjects of their feudal lords as tyrants. For 4 decades, then, an Ancien regime did not take hold as quote-unquote tyrannical indigenous elites, tyrannical local lords, caciques, tyrannical conquistador, tyrannical governors, and lesser conquistadors, and tyrannical friars repeatedly found themselves crushed by the rival petitions, litigations, and witness statements. So here you have the typical vocabulary, political vocabulary that was used at the time. This is Las Casas' summa or summary of the junta of the controversy in Valladolid with Sepúlveda of 1552. And here you have highlighted how he presents the conquest of Spain as a conquest of tyrants. It says, lo contrario defendió y afirmó haber sido y ser posible no serlo, tiránicas, injustas e iniquas. That is, he affirms, he says that all his conquest was driven by tyrants that were unjust and thriving in inequities. The same for his other treatise of 1522, the 20 treatises against the encomienda, again, the argument of the tyranny of the encomenderos. But the tyranny of the encomenderos is not only a genre used by the Dominicans like Las Casas, a genre used by indigenous communities. This is the so-called Codex Kingsborough, a British library that is an extraordinary archive of about 30 years of history of Tepetleo stock. It's an altepetl in central Mexico that documents about 40 years of tribute by this community and the changing social contracts of this community with different visitadores, different encomenderos, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the tropes running through this archive that details every single turkey egg that the community gave to an encomendero or a governor or a judge for over 30 years, includes this element of the abusive encomendero or the representative of the encomendero. And it's repeated over and over. Here you have the case of 1525, in which the representative of Cortes, his commercial agent, burns caciques in Tepeleo stock. In addition, with all the different tribute that the community has contributed. Again, the trope of the tyrant that needs to be disciplined in the same document. Now, this is not only true of encomenderos. The genre of petitions that present encomenderos and conquistadors as tyrants is mirror in indigenous communities in which they begin to petition against their own caciques. Here you have the case of Codex Reis, that is at the Brandakey at Yale University. It's a document of 1565 that documents property in Tenochtitlan, near the lake of Tenochtitlan. And what you have here is kind of the annals of the community. You have the ruler, the traditional cacique or traditional elites of Tenochtitlan that are kind of bracketed by the arrival of a commoner judge. This is not a traditional cacique. This is not a traditional Moctezuma or traditional elite of Tenochtitlan, but it's simply a judge of commoner origins that came from some other community in order to rule over Tenochtitlan for a few years in order to settle disputes. So you begin to see the arrival of commoners that made alliances with viceroys in order to intervene in conflict within communities. And these commoners act as visitadores or act as judges or as governors themselves. So you begin to see the rise of these commoner clans in alliances with viceroys or corregidores or judges or oidores that begin to leverage power vis-a-vis traditional caciques, and the caciques and indigenous nobilities begin to lose power. Here you have the Codex Oban, British Museum, that documents in 1548 not only the different events happening in Tenochtitlan year by year, 1546, etc., but the arrival, for instance, of the Juez Mateo Juarez, who is a commoner, who comes with a vara of justice. In 1548, the Codex Oban also documents the arrival of Esteban, this is not Don Esteban, a commoner, in 1559. Again, this is not the traditional Tenochtla elites of the Moctezumas. 1559, you have a commoner, judge, visitador, that is going to mete out justice within Tenochtitlan and is kind of controlling the tyranny of the caciques. This is another document that is fascinating because it demonstrates the changes within these communities. This is the Codex Coyoacán in Simancas that documents about 30 years of tribute and changes in tribute and social contracts in Coyoacán and neighboring towns. So here you have the column of the 27 years of tribute paid by porters, that is slaves, women, males of different types, with different types of property. You can see the details of tribute, then the arrival of visitador with an indigenous lord, that is a commoner, that arrives and changes the degree of, this is Lucas, this is not Don Lucas, this is Lucas, a judge, commoner, that arrives with el doctor Quesada, that begins to change the nature of the tribute in Coyoacán. That it begins to be not only in kind, but also in pesos, monetary. And then there's the arrival of a new social contract by the 1550s with a new judge, the judge Fuero with the judge commoner Miguel. He's not Don Miguel, he's not a cacique. And it changes the nature of the tribute in Coyoacán. And the tribute begins to diminish in size and begins to be transformed ever more so into monetary tribute as commoners begin to demand transformation in the tribute. This is yet another document of 1550 that documents how caciques begin to lose power within these communities. Commoners begin to limit the power of caciques, begin to control make distinctions between patrimonial property of caciques, upon which the caciques begin to build cacicazgos or mayorazgos. They begin to use it as private property and begin to leverage that private property of the cacicazgo in order to become merchants. Many of them become powerful merchants and begin to separate themselves from the politics of the community. That slowly begins to fall in the hands of commoners. So here you have the cabildo of the town that it's multiplying. It's not only the cacique, but you have commoners, oficiales that are commoners that through rotation begin to participate in the governance of the town. But it's not only that, the trope of the tyrant that begins to limit the power of elites, but the participation of commoners and slaves, indigenous slaves in many, many other ways. Let me move to that as well. Running through these documents, okay. Our work calls attention to one of the most remarkable and little known chapters of social mobilization and cross-ethnic alliances through paperwork, namely the emancipation of indigenous slaves and the rise of commoners. This is, well, I just show you the case of the Codex Ohuapan, the Codex Coyoacán, but I want to focus on this particular one. Drawing on a deep-seated moral and theological doubts within an empire that assumed natives to be vassals, but that also promoted expansion by encouraging raiding, captivity, and vast internal indigenous slave markets, tens of thousands of slaves secure emancipation through petitioning via summary justice before indigenous and European judges and visitadores. Slaves often secure some restitution and offers of resettlement. So the new laws of 1542, in this particularly in Mexico and Peru, set off this large movement of emancipation from the bottom up by slaves that begin to petition for emancipation. Here you have the case of, it's called the Codice Cuzio, it's in the British private archive, that documents about the petition of 14 Otomi slaves in the region of Cuzio towards Colima, towards the lowlands of Michoacán, where mines, gold mines began to appear. So many of these slaves were taken by Nahuatl lords to work in the mines. And here you have Cuni, slave, Otomi slave, that argues that before he was moved to the mines to work with these Nahuatl lords and encomenderos, he was a lord himself, or he was a middleman in some indigenous community in central Mexico and Otomi, and he had all this property that is described here. He had turkeys, he had some china, he had vassals, he had all sorts of goods and objects and material and pesos as well, money that belonged to him. And each one of these slaves in Cuzio, Otomis, presented this petition and they were emancipated, they were set free, and their property was restituted. The case of Maseguales and commoners in central Mexico is also a case in point. This is the Oxtotipac mapa or map of Oxtotipac in Tlaxcala in 1540 that resulted from the trial of the cacique of Tlaxcala, Don Carlos, who was burned by Zumárraga, the Inquisition. When Zumárraga burned the cacique because he was denounced by commoners in nearby towns and by women because he had raped women in his household and he was polygamous, etc. Commoners used the Inquisition to denounce lords like Don Carlos of Texcoco, excuse me, not Tlaxcala, Texcoco. And what's interesting about this document is that when Carlos is burned, his property goes to the Inquisition as a matter of principle. But that triggered a litigation. All sorts of parties within the community of Texcoco begin to fight over this property. And so other lords begin to argue that this property, the palace of Don Carlos, wasn't really his. It was property, it was realengo. It was property of the elites as a whole and did not belong to any particular individual. And then the largest chunk of land of Don Carlos begins to be claimed by the Maseguales as their property as well, that could not be just given away to the Inquisition. They had plots of lands. This is a marvelous document that shows how Aztec algebra worked, how to calculate the dimension of plots of land and how to calculate the length and the size of these different plots. And so every plot of land has a name in Nahuatl glyphs, and it has a property owner, as it were, that is a Masegual that has claims over this property. You have here the 45, or I don't know, there are different numbers of Maseguales that are claiming possession over these lands that is no longer Don Carlos's land. And finally, here in the lower corner, well, here in this corner, you have the description of Carlos's cacique patrimonial land that he used in order to make businesses with European settlers in order to graft in local trees European fruits. So here you have an experiment on grafting of apricots and apples, etc., located in different places within the community of Texcoco. The only property that actually belonged to Don Carlos is this one that was given that he bought, that was given to him as gifts, patrimonial gifts by family, etc., etc. What the map documents is actually the separation of three types of property that is no longer controlled by caciques. One is the realengo property that eventually the crown would use in order to, and viceroys would use to mete out patronage to clients. Realengo property, that is property of the crown or property of the elites as a whole, not as individuals. Patrimonial land of elites that is used in order to make business and become merchants and accumulate cash, and commons, property that belongs to the community and belongs to commoners within the community and can now be claimed by caciques. This is an important development, a huge agrarian reform that is happening all over central Mexico and Peru as well. Now, what is interesting about the case of Cacique Carlos of Texcoco is that the process is initiated by commoners and women within the Inquisition. So lords, in order to maintain property and maintain power, they had to get along well with commoners and slaves within their households. They could be denounced by the Inquisition. The Inquisition becomes a tool for commoners and people without power to discipline elites and merchants, eventually conversos, but not only conversos, caciques, and everyone else for that matter. You needed to establish very good relationships with your household slaves and your household family, women, etc., not to be denounced and not for your property not to be taken away. Now, this is another interesting document from 1578 that documents 17 neighborhoods in the Altepetle of Huejotzinco, in which the different communities denounced the caciques for exploiting the different neighborhoods over the course of 7 years. This is from 1572, from 1572 to 1578. They document the various charges that different members of the Cabildo had on the community, the different, they are called cordilleras. They are not willing, I mean, they force the community to provide extra tribute, but they also separate the tribute from the commons, the property that the barrio had accumulated. And so you begin to see the separation of patrimonial property from common property, the commons of the community, and separation of tribute to the crown from wealth of the community. And the wealth of the community is very, very varied. It's not just corn, and it's not just this and the other agrarian property. We're talking about census. We're talking about financial resources. They are owners of houses. They are renting houses in communities far away. The commons, the commoners, are becoming very, very astute financiers using the resources in order to multiply wealth. I don't know how much time I have left, but I'll continue with this. So indigenous commoners mobilized through petitioning and paperwork, securing titles and establishing legal differences between cacique, patrimonial property, and community property. Commoners also wrestled political power away from all elites by either accessing political representation and indigenous cabildos, or by simply separating themselves ethnically from multi-ethnic polities and neighborhoods and settling new lands. So this is also fascinating. In our book, we seek to explain as well how non-European knowledge and experimental science flourished through paperwork in the 16th century. Scholars have widely regarded grace or privileged paperwork as conservative genre used by conquistadors to boastfully and repeatedly assert their merit before the crown. We argue this ostensibly hidebound paperwork, considered broadly within its social context, could elicit profoundly non-traditional knowledge production, encouraging, for example, indigenous agents to produce and maintain proofs of individual, community, and regional privileges, which reached back into the mist of time and used epistemological frameworks unintelligible to Spanish authorities. Here you have the case of the Mapa of Coatinchan, community of Coatinchan of commoners, that begin to argue that Huejotzinco and Puebla, the communities nearby, are taking advantage of these commoners. These were commoners that in the past were lords, and they begin to produce these maps of conquests in which they represented, Tolan represented the Toltecas and Chichimecas, and they were defeated by the Mixtecas, and an alliance of Mixtecas and Nahuas. And so the map is, it comes from commoners that are claiming to have some kind of elite background back in antiquity when they used to be lords, when they represented Tolan and the alliance of Tolan and Chichimeca alliance that was defeated in the 1400s by the alliance of the Nahua or Tenochtitlan elites of central Mexico with the Mixtecas of Oaxaca. There are many other of these documents created by commoners with very odd epistemological structures. The case of the map of Cuacochecholan, with a kind of a description of the role of this community in the conquest of Guatemala that has been very well studied in this book, Indian Conquistadors. It's an odd document that kind of draws on epistemological indigenous traditions of this community with glyphs and so on and so forth that seek to make a claim for the participation of the conquest of Guatemala in an alliance between these communities of central Mexico, Tlaxcalans and Cuaquechoyan with Alvarado, that led to privileges in Guatemala on the part of this community. So again, commoners that begin to gain lineage and gain rights far away in Guatemala using this type of petitioning and documentation. Now, I want to finish my talk, I think I'm running out of time, with what happens with archives. These are all local archives, these are all archives of elites, commoners, etc., that allow them to gain mobility, but then you have the problem of controlling all this petitioning and mediating among all these parties that are making alternative arguments. And you have the case of the vice-regal power of central Mexico, viceroys like Mendoza and Velasco, that through the creation of archives begin to have control over this mess, this factionalism. So you have Las Ordenanzas y Recopilaciones de Mendoza of 1548. The viceroy has issued tens of thousands of mandamientos and ordenanzas that need to be indexed and need to be archived. So there is a record that these communities had already, their demands had already been met, and the viceroy is now repeating yet again a process that was already settled. So you needed archives for that, and the viceroy gains power over all these local lords like Alvarado, like Cortes, like Nuño, in the case of Mendoza, just by controlling archives. He manages to defeat all these four powerful conquistadors that were casting shadow over Mendoza by simply the control of this type of documentation and archives that allow the viceroy to become mediator in conflicts among indigenous communities or indigenous communities with encomenderos or indigenous communities with friars, etc., etc. The same for the first cedulario, the first compilation of the laws of the Indies are not imperial cedularios, and a cedulario that emerges in Mexico is Vasco de Puga Cedulario of 1563 that services the interest of Velasco, the viceroy at the time, in order to index and codify all the mandamientos and requerimientos and ordenanzas he had created as well, like 30,000 of them. Our book argues that the Indies bottom-up paperwork, its distance and its non-European epistemologies and its feuding factions all produce a rich culture of textual skepticism. Scholars today frequently regard textual skepticism as an exclusively Northern European form of thought endemic among free-thinking liberals. Indeed, many suggest a tie between skepticism, democracy, and late modernity. We demonstrate that the furious paperwork battles of the 16th century Indies not only gave rise to a sustained culture of skepticism and doubt about the writing and word-based depiction of reality in the halls of Habsburg power, but that this skeptical culture was shared and encouraged by all Indies subjects, no matter how humble, as they sought to transform the world through paperwork. Yet despite all the immense social mobility and cultural and epistemological radicalism triggered by European invasion of the Americas, roughly between 1570 and 1600, a new type of Ancien regime began to emerge in the Indies that was alien to the indigenous conquistador and monastic feudalisms, which arose and collapsed in the years 1530 and 1570. The scholars have identified two main reasons for this transition: the expansion of royal power in the Indies and the replacement of feudal labor in the core regions for a complex partly cash-based market economy. We add a third fundamental force in this model, archives. The rather innocuous boxes which all vassals filled with both royal privileges and money had been gradually accumulating in every household and corporation in the Indies, in the homes of the humblest Indian widow and the mightiest conquistador governor. Major paperwork battles about wealth, jurisdiction, and social privilege hinged on these archives. The crown engaged in decades-long legalistic battles against its Indies rivals, began to build one of the world's greatest archives by the 1550s, ordering new world privileges, bureaucratically strangling its powerful foes and bringing about legal standardization. I just showed the case of the Viceroyal Archives. Increasingly powerful royal officials, viceroys, bishops, and inquisitors simultaneously deepened vassal needs for archives while often counteracting bureaucratization by creating their own patrimonial networks. These officials, hungry for revenue to compensate for Indian demographic collapse and expensive anti-piracy measures, allow for commodification of status, trading money for privileges. So here you have the case of bishops that began to fight with the friars that argue that they have privileges from the papacy, bullas that gave them power, privileges given by the papacy, and the bishops begin to create their own archives, the councils, the Third Council of Mexico, the Third Council of Peru, that begin to document and put in paper new rules for the entire bishoprics and dioceses, and begin to take power away from the friars. The Inquisition as well becomes a very powerful player that with Viceroyal Archives and with bishopric archives, that is cathedral archives, Inquisition archives begin to tame the power of different individuals. You need access to these centers of power, to the Viceroy, to the Inquisition, to the bishop, in order, and cash, in order to control your power within these communities. If you don't have the archive and you don't have relationship to these powers, you can be crushed easily. And that is something that that begins to happen. Now, the crown in Spain begins to create its own archives, separate from those of the Inquisition in Mexico or Peru, separate from those of viceroys in Mexico and Peru, and separate from those of other regional powers. So it's a case of the cédulas of all these recopilaciones indias of Ovando, all these ordenanzas that the crown begins to organize in the 1570s and 1580s that begin to be published, some of them, and others remain unpublished. Now, let me finish with these couple of examples of how archives begin to be manipulated. Money began to move entire archives as Otomi peasants bought Moctezuma's elites privileges, and Spaniards blackmailed rivals with Inquisition papers. Merchant families swallowed conquistador and indigenous elite branches, seeking to maximize others' privileges to achieve greater revenue for themselves. So here is the famous Codex Cocatzin that has been attributed to 1572, a community in to the north of Mexico that argues that Moctezuma, the so-called Diego de Mendoza, Austria Moctezuma, had taken property away from these commoners on the lake, on the Chinampas of Mexico. Well, it turns out that this document is all a forgery produced in the early 1700s, by a group of Otomi individuals who had bought the archive of Diego de Mendoza, or Diego Moctezuma, that in the hands of this Otomi became Diego de Mendoza, Austria Moctezuma. Here you have the case of commoner Otomis that had the cash and the wherewithal to acquire the archive of a branch of the family of Moctezuma that was not powerful enough at the time, didn't have the cash, It had connections with the crown, but didn't have the cash. And they were superseded by these Ottoman commoners that acquired their archives and created all sorts of claims over land and property and became lords themselves. There is the example also of Diego Muñoz Camargo in Tlaxcala, which is another interesting case. All around, in this textual production and society became increasingly archival and commercial by the late 1500s. By 1600, then, vassals like the part Tlaxcalan, Diego Muñoz Camargo, and others needed to master the Indies' three cornerstones to survive and thrive: mastery of archives, royal approval, and wealth. A new Ancien regime comprised of savvy vassals, rich bureaucrats, and powerful officials and merchants who consumed the privileges of anemic conquistador and indigenous lords emerged. This is the case of Diego Muñoz Camargo, a mestizo, an individual whose father was Spaniard, mother indigenous, who had no business whatsoever in Tlaxcala, who could not be a lord, but who became an interpreter for the viceroy, and as an interpreter for the viceroy, began to deal with the indigenous communities in Tlaxcala and began to offer them better deals in litigation. And these communities began to offer them his archive, their archives, and he began to accumulate wealth. And by the end of his life, Diego Muñoz Camargo, who was a commoner, who was a no one in Tlaxcala, became a lord and cacique of Tlaxcala. This is a good example of how things work. The Spanish-American Ancien regime's rocky evolution ensured that while it did not meet liberal democratic benchmarks, it excelled in stimulating massive participation in rule and a culture of anti-tyrannical agitation, radical politics, widespread skepticism, and profound questioning of previous social orders. Many of the elements so cherished by the exceptionalist liberal British historiography were in fact integral to the Spanish New World. When the Ancien regime finally set root in the late 1500s, its more ossified structures now presented vassals with a challenging but sometimes attainable pathway to elite status, not through blue blood or money alone, but through deft exploitation of paperwork. This society was neither purely feudal and violent, nor fundamentally capitalistic. It was underpinned as well by an unlikely third force: millions of inert and innocuous pieces of paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. That was, like a lot of your work, it is, and in this case, I acknowledge that it's a project that you're working on collaboratively with Adrian Masters. It is a granular study of a lot of archival materials that several points in the talk, you take us, there's a horizon to the talk, and at several points in the talk, you take us to the horizon so that we can see beyond in the distance the sort of enormous implications of what it is that you're recording so minutely. And what I'd like to ask you in a couple of questions, and I think our audience has questions like this too, I'd like to sort of ask you about the oscillation between the big implications off in the distance and the particularities that you're talking about here. So here's the first, and by the way, to the audience members, we will try to get to all of the questions. I'm trying to, I will digest them and pose them to Jorge. We'll do our best to get to all of them if we can in the 25 minutes or so that we have left. So first question I want to ask is this. You know, there is a conventional view in historiography that would think of archives as instruments of state power, and I'm wondering whether the implications of your project would overturn that understanding of the relation between archives and state power.
That is, yes. That is an important question because there are all these layers to the archives that we are following. There is the local archive, the family archive, the community archive that allow these communities, individuals, conquistadors, and everyone else, for that matter, to litigate and to petition and to gain gracia, mercedes, recognition, and also to manipulate the law and create cédulas, mandamientos, ordenanzas through petition. So these are sources that empower individuals and empower communities and empower families, and that also allow for upward social mobility, but also sudden downward social mobility. So there is a lot of up and downs in this system that is characterized by manipulation of paperwork and great creativity. And that is all based on reliance on probanzas, testimonies. We just don't know. I mean, all these things could be made up, literally. They are just acknowledged through this system of probanza. You have enough witnesses that they do count, and these are the foundational documents of colonization and conquest that are still with us. Now, then there is this other dimension to the archives, that is the Viceroyal Archive, the regional archive of cathedral chapters, the regional archive of local inquisitions. And these archives are key for the creation, in the case of Mendoza and Velasco, the creation of something we call viceregal power. Mendoza was an individual who went to the Indies with very little crown support. There is this model of Italian viceroy that is weakened, emasculated via other powers, the señores, the grand lords of Naples, and so on and so forth. Those were the viceroy of Naples, the viceroy of Italy. In the Spanish model, it's an emasculated representative of the crown. And so Mendoza arrives in the Indies with that model, with very little power. The accountants of the king and the treasurers and the judges and everybody else has just as much power and resources as Mendoza. And there are 4 big lords in Mexico that really, really dominate in terms of resources, encomienda, capital, wherewithal, the polity, namely Cortes, Alvarado in Guatemala, the Tellos in Yucatan, and particularly Nuño de Guzman. And these 4 lords are the ones that have the resources to organize campaigns, go to the north, go to Panuco, go to this and the other. And Mendoza has nothing. His income is very small. He's a lord from the grandees of Spain, but he's not the first son. He has very little resources. But by the 1540s, he's become the most important broker in Mexico. He has displaced completely all these 4 rivals. And he manages by 1540s to finance expeditions to the north on his own. Coronado's expedition and his own expedition of the Mixton War. How that happened? That is the question. And it happens through this control of mediation and paperwork. So first Mendoza begins to mediate among all these communities with the help of the Franciscans. The Franciscans are kind of the support behind Mendoza. And these communities begin to rely on Mendoza to settle disputes between themselves, within the communities, and also with conquistadors. And that power of patronage allowed him to build resources to co-opt the representatives of the crown, representatives of the conquistadors, etc., and build massive power. The same for the bishops, the same for the Inquisition. Now, there's this third element of the archive, of imperial archive, that is neither local nor regional, but is imperial, which is the reforms of Obando in the 1570s of the council that lead to the indexing of all this Gracian Gobierno paperwork that is massive. We're talking about 300, 400,000 cédulas by 1600, royal decrees. We have hundreds of thousands, hundreds of thousands of petitions and gracia issues, etc., that need to be known by the crown in order to affect and be a player itself in these local politics, how to wrestle power away from bishops, that kind of forced patronat real, how to wrestle power away from viceroys like Mendoza or Velasco that have created networks of patronage of their own. So the state, the imperial archive allows the empire to gain power, but also there are all these other archives that allow others to gain power. So it's a very difficult dynamic and process that is not as simple-minded as the historiography seems to imagine.
With apologies to the audience, we have more questions than I can possibly get to in 20 minutes. I will pass them on as best I can. One of our audience members asks you this: the second half of the 16th century is also a period where the genre of Nahua historiography, and I apologize for my pronunciation of the Nahua term, Shia Powali or something like that, or annals, prosper during this period. Do you consider this part of the culture of litigation?
Well, again, I think the historiography has this issue of litigation wrong. It's not just litigation we're talking about. We are talking about three branches of government that are separate and distinct and different. One is gracia, that is through petitioning, and provanzas, and coat of arms, whatever. I mean, merit, rewards, blah blah blah. Many of these annals have to do with gracia. I mean, we have the case of the Lienzo de Tlaxcala of Camargo, the Historia of Tlaxcala of Muñoz Camargo, and others that are created on the part of Muñoz Camargo to gain gracia vis-a-vis the viceroy or the crown. So Guamán Poma de Yal is a good example, Garcilaso Inca de la Vega, etc. These are individuals who are that are playing the game of gracia through their own scholarship, through their own assembling of materials that would allow them to become mediators or interpreters or translators or paralegals or whatever. And they become judges in the case of Ixtlixotli in Alba Ixtlixotli in Mexico, who is from a cacique family in Teotihuacan, who kind of rearranges the history of Texcoco and Chichimeca origins of Texcoco, etc., coming from a family up north that has little to do with the caciques of Texcoco, but becomes central through his skills as a synthesizer of histories and compiler of archives of the vice-regal court of indigenous litigation. And so he becomes translator, amasses power, and eventually through petitioning and gracia becomes also judge and governor of many communities. So that is gracia. And then there is gobierno, which is not litigation, which is the petitioning on the part of communities or individuals or whoever to the crown to change the law or to issue cédulas, to issue mandamientos, to issue requerimientos, to issue ordenanzas, be that the viceroy or the bishop or the crown. And you have hundreds of thousands of these things that are emerging all over the Indies. This is, we call it law. These are rules that are essentially verbatim copies of letters sent by petitioners. And finally, there's litigation, which is court. I mean, whatever happened with oidores and in audiencias, which is, it's very expensive. Most people cannot participate. It takes lawyers and procuradores and so on and so forth. And the historiography is being kind of obsessed with litigation and this aspect of gobierno or governance, and it's forgotten these two other dimensions. And I would say that the annales and etc. Have less to do with litigation and more to do with gracia and gobierno.
Okay, thank you. Another question from the audience. Could it be said that the petition system empowered the individual at the expense of the community? You mentioned the tax reforms of the 1560s, and my understanding is that those reforms not only monetized taxes to the king, as you mentioned, but also individualized them and ended exemptions for indigenous elites. How do you deal with the fact that some of these petitions not only empowered commoners, but I believe, our questioner believes, also helped the crown undermine traditional indigenous social hierarchy and collectives? Again, is this radical empowerment of individuals as opposed to communities?
Well, it's complicated. It's not, the trajectory is very complicated. And this is what is fascinating about the process, that there is no, many times there is no direction, there is no teleology to this. It's not that the commoners are winning all the time over elites. So you have the case of Huatlinchan, this community of commoners that is disputing the dominance of Huehuetzinco in Puebla, or in the region of Puebla. And they begin to dispute, and they begin to win, and they begin to eventually gain land back from the lords of Huehuetzinco. And by 1560s, they are again crushed by the lords. So they lost whatever they had won in the 1540s, 1550s, 1560s. So there is no teleology to this change. I mean, it depends on what is going on, your access to connections, patronage, your access to cash, and your access to archives, whether your archives are better or good enough to compete with the archives of your rivals, and so and your own alliances, because there are so many factions here that you need to position yourself vis-a-vis other factions, and those who position themselves better than others win. And sometimes commoners do, and sometimes caciques do. So it's not that simple. It's not, oh yeah, there is some kind of great social advance here in which commoners and slaves are winning. No, I mean, there is slavery continues. But many of these commoners, slaves of Otomís that were liberated, became eventually lords in Querétaro. So most of the towns of the mining regions from Querétaro north come from humble Otomí slaves in Nahua multi-ethnic communities that escape these communities and then begin to have these big claims of lordship. And that is true everywhere. It's not just the case of Otomís in Querétaro. There are many other cases. So our argument is that it all depends, and it all depends on this tripartite structure of access to key players, either directly to the crown in Madrid by sending your procuradores or sending your own, or access to viceroys, bishops, and inquisition. And once you have access to that, you need a lot of cash. And so if you have cash, it can be a commoner, and you can buy the archives of lords that are poor or impoverished. And these lords give up their archives, and they wind up in the hands of commoners who have access to, through their cash, have access to these centers of power. And those who have no archives might lose eventually, even though they have cash, or have access to centers of power. The case of conversos, for instance, merchant conversos, whose archives are not, do not master. Sometimes they are not good enough, and therefore they lose their dominance, even though they might have lots and lots and lots of cash.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. It's about elevating something that could have been seen in the past as a sort of inert scene of the colonial period and making it one of the actual places where power is contested and a factor in a way that we haven't understood in the past. Can I ask you a couple of, actually it's just one question, but it's about two terms. It's a terminological question. The project, as I understand it from your talk today, depends on your and Adrian Masters choosing to use two terms that strike me as somewhat loaded. And that is to say, the project could be undertaken by someone else without using those terms at all, using the same evidence, but with perhaps putting a different spin on the conclusions. And those two terms are Ancien regime and radical. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about gloss those terms for us as you're using them.
Well, this has to do with one of the reasons why I'm here, I guess, the politics and my public persona in academia in the United States, my battle over historiography and the way the history of Latin America is taught and presented, with all these models of ossification and colonial legacies and BS. Lack of dynamism, corruption, and all that BS that is so typical of gringo academia and also Latin American academia, by the way. And it's been that struggle over these shibboleths and these patronizing, condescending narratives that have been driven me for 20 some years in this country to really upset those narratives, from the Enlightenment to this. So yeah, it's radical. It is freaking radical. It's far more radical than anything the British ever did, in terms of participation of commoners, in terms of participation of democratic participation from the bottom up. And yet we have these narratives like John Eliot's narrative of the Atlantic empires, that it's the opposite. It's amazing how an ossified empire that was white supremacist to the core, which is the British Empire, comes across as democratic and comes across as religiously tolerant, and so on and so forth. And the Spanish Empire comes across as some kind of authoritarian oligarchy with little participation from the bottom up and some kind of Ancien regime, ossified Ancien regime. I am sick and tired of that narrative, and this book is about kind of cutting that narrative to size. It needs some undermining, massive undermining, and we are doing it. So we put to rest these so central narrative to Latinx identity in this country, the politics of Latinx and Latin politics as the society of colonial legacies and corruption and whatever, that is so annoying personally to me. So that's radical. And Ancien regime, Ancien regime, it is an Ancien regime, but it's not the European Ancien regime. It's kind of unique. I mean, there is hierarchies. I mean, we are not denying that that these things are structuring hierarchies that are limiting mobility. There is great mobility for 40, 50 years, and that mobility begins to be regulated and codified, and the access to that mobility begins to be kind of policed and structured, as opposed to in the past that it was kind of unregulated, and everybody kind of whoever created the better archives and the better access to different patrons could win. Now you have a system that is the channel that depends on these three things. And if you have access to those three things, no matter who you are, you might be a mestizo, no one like Muñoz Camargo, or a Guamán Poma who pretends to be a noble, but he's also a commoner from somewhere else, from somewhere in central Peru, that are making big claims and are gaining power. And are acquiring archives and establishing lineages that became stable over time, but also can be toppled, so you can have great encomenderos or great entrepreneurs, again, the case of Conversos, but others, who might have very good connections to Viceroy or to an Audiencia, might have cash, but they are lacking in the archives, and they can be beaten by rivals. They can be beaten by rivals that have the other things. They have the archives and they have the cash and they have the connections to patrons. So the need on the part of the crown for cash, as the geopolitics of the Americas change, allow for this new type of mobility in which archives can be purchased and sold and distributed to those who have the money to create them. So the foundational documents of the previous 4 decades begin to circulate and begin to move around, and forgeries begin to also happen. There's a lot of fake documentation, as I argued, in which the archives of lords begin to be cannibalized by indigenous commoners all over central Mexico, and you have the whole genre of fake titles, land titles in the 1600s.
I'm glad you articulated the big stakes of the project for historiography there, because I know this is something we will come back to in Friday's event, and I think what you just said sets the stage for, I think, some of the things we will get to at that point. And in fact, I'm going to do something a little unconventional because I have so many questions that I can't get to, and we have just 2 minutes left. I'm going to pose a question now, and I'm actually going to defer asking you for the answer until Friday because it connects to Friday's event. And this is the question for you and for the audience to think about. It comes from an audience member. What can the radicals of the present learn from the radical paper pushers of the 16th century?
A lot.
Isn't that, yeah, that's what I imagine you would say. So I can't wait until we can continue that conversation. So, we're at the end, and again, apologies to so many people that asked great questions for the fact that I can't get to all of them, but we have another event, and I want to invite everyone who's watching us now to join us Friday of this week at 11 a.m. Pacific time for another event with Jorge Cañizares entitled Conversations on the History of Hispanics in scare quotes, in the US, from marginality to more marginality, the case of Latinx faculty. We will continue this conversation and also turn it toward the very particular kind of institutional impact of Jorge's work at UT Austin and the implications of all that for the moment that we're in. Jorge, I really want to thank you for a very stimulating hour and a half. We can't wait to continue it on Friday. And let me invite everybody here, not only to plan to join us on Friday, but to please hold October 20th on your calendar for this year's presidential lecture in the humanities featuring the philosopher Achille Mbembe. He will be joining us in late October. You can find details of all of our events on the Humanities Center's website, shc.stanford.edu. Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, audience. And we hope to see you all Friday.